have you ever been disappointed? Right? You ever been disappointed? I mean, and maybe you just wanted something so bad. Or maybe you hoped so desperately that someone would make the right choice, someone that you care for. Maybe you had some hope for a job that would come through for you, or a move or whatever, and it didn't happen. Your ship didn't come in, and you feel disappointed. And if you're anything like me, I'm guessing you've been at that place of disappointment more times than you can count, and you've probably, if you're anything like me, you've probably also disappointed others at some of those times too. But have you ever been disappointed? And you get to that point and you're just kind of like, what now? And we're in this teaching series called Hard Gifts. I hope you're getting something out of this, but the idea is that sometimes there are hard things in life that come our way. We get stuck between that rock and a hard place. And then we don't know what we're going to do, but it turns out that some of those hard places can open up by the grace of God into moments of growth, moments of hope, moments where we learn more deeply what it means to walk with God in the land of the living. And it turns out, I think, that some of those hard situations can actually be gifts. Now, disappointment might be one of those. I mean, life is filled with disappointment, but I'm convinced that sometimes disappointment allows us to realign our hopes in God. And sometimes that realignment is a little bit painful, right? Sometimes that moment where we've got our hopes on something and it doesn't come through, that moment is hard. It hurts a little bit. And I remember a gentleman that I knew, and he had gone through this situation, and his wife had said, well, he's been pretty grumpy and hard to live with lately, and I don't know what I'm going to do with my husband. He was in this kind of state of perpetual grumpiness. Maybe that's some of us sometimes, but there he was. Well, then she calls me up and says, Pastor, good news. He broke his sternum today. And I said, no, I'm like, can you repeat that, please? He broke his sternum, just a little crack, and it turned out that that was the issue, and he broke it, and he went through, there was this little day of pain, but now he's able to breathe easier, like it was just this crack that had to happen, and he's not so grumpy anymore. And I said, okay, if that's what it took to get him to that good place, great. But sometimes that moment, right, where something's got to give, and it does, sometimes that's a painful moment, but possibly it leads through to a place where we can grow and we can breathe again. And I wonder if disappointment's a little bit like that, right? Where it allows us to get realigned, crunched back into place, realign our hope with God. And we see some of this in Jesus' own life, this realignment of people's hopes as he's talking to them. And I think about that passage that we heard today from John chapter 11, where Mary and Martha, some dear friends of Jesus, they live in Bethany. We're told it's not far from Jerusalem. And they lost their brother Lazarus, who is also Jesus' dear friend. And it says in verse 21, in 11:21, this is the key verse for us. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And so Martha comes to him, my brother wouldn't have died if you would have been here, Jesus. And we got to hear this the right way. I mean, Martha, she is a person of faith. She trusts Jesus. She loves Jesus. And that is crystal clear in the next couple of verses. It plays out there. You see her love for him and her trust in him. But there's also, I think, this little hint of maybe some disappointment. This, if you would have been here. Right? This, if only you would have been here, Jesus, my brother would not have died. And I wonder if there was a part of Martha that even in her faith was a little bit disappointed and saying in her mind, couldn't you have come a little faster, Jesus? I mean, it's not like Jerusalem is far away. Couldn't you have gotten here just a little bit quicker? My brother would still be alive. And maybe there was just a little bit of disappointment there. And we know from the gospel that Jesus intentionally took his time, right? He was in no rush. And I think Jesus showed up in Bethany, where Mary and Martha and Lazarus were at exactly the moment that he wanted to show up, and not one moment earlier. I don't think he was late at all. Because it turns out that Jesus came with a plan and his own purpose, and he was on time for that plan and that purpose. But you see, from Mary and Martha's point of view, these two bereaved sisters, it probably looks like Jesus was a little bit late. So just maybe enveloped in Martha's statement of faith, there's just that little bit of disappointment. I mean, we know she has faith because she says, I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask, right? She believes in him. She says, I know my brother will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. So, I mean, she's got that faith. And when Jesus asked her, do you believe that I'm the resurrection and the life? She responded, yes, Lord, I believe, right? I believe you're the Messiah. I believe you're the Son of God. I believe you're the one who's come into the world. So, I mean, she's faithful. But, you wonder, is there that little corner of her mind that's wondering, hey, if you would have turned up sooner, would my brother still be alive? And I don't know about you, if you've ever been in a place like Martha, facing sickness, facing loss, facing some kind of sadness, facing death, and wondering, when is God going to show up? When is Jesus going to turn up and help me? And if you've ever prayed, you've probably asked yourself this question, and I think it's okay to ask this question. Is this prayer doing anything? Is prayer changing anything? Is God going to show up? And I think sometimes, even as people of faith, we can experience a little bit of disappointment with God. Now, we would not be the first who would experience disappointment with God. I mean, if you have looked through the Psalms at any time, you know that there is all kinds of disappointment in the Psalms, and that disappointment actually comes from a place of faith that's saying, God, I believe you, and I trust you, and I follow you, and I've staked my life on you, so where are you? And you see that in the Psalms. You see it in Psalm 10, where the psalmist cries to God and says, why do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? Right? Or Psalm 73 that looks at the life of those who don't care about God, who do evil, who lie. And it says that it seems like God, it works out best for those people. It says their bodies are sleek and healthy. Why is that, God? What about me? The writer says in Psalm 73, surely in vain I have kept my heart pure and have washed my hands in innocence. Then Psalm 22. That poignant, powerful psalm, especially during the season of Lent, it comes up in Holy Week, right? Where Jesus takes those words from the beginning of Psalm 22 and says, my God, why have you forsaken me? I mean, those are the words that Jesus himself takes on the cross. And so, that's disappointment. Where are you, God? That we read in the Psalms. And maybe you're kind of feeling like you're not supposed to say that, right? You're not supposed to ever admit that there can be moments of disappointment with God, right? I mean, we're not supposed to say that and admit that. And we might kind of imagine that people in the Bible were all saints, that all these people of faith who, they're kind of like porcelain statues, and they just walk through life never doubting, never flinching, never worrying. They're just completely focused on God and never have this dark moment. They never cry out, God, what are you doing? Where are you? But that is not the vision of the people that we see in the Scriptures, right? That's not the word from the Psalms. We see people who are real and flesh and blood just like us, and who experience the same kinds of doubts and worries and frustrations and dry times in prayer, just like I think many of us do. Sometimes they were disappointed with God. I remember once Lisi and I went to visit this couple many, many years ago, and it was right before Christmas, and the man of the house, he had been stringing up Christmas lights for his boss, right? You kind of can imagine where this story is going to go, but it's winter, it's cold, it's icy, and he's stringing up Christmas lights, and he's up on a ladder, and he slipped. And he fell, and he landed wrong on his leg, and so there he was. He's at home with this cast on his leg because he broke his ankle or something, and stringing up Christmas lights and falls off the ladder. And so we go and we show up armed with a Bible and a smile, and come into their house and kind of were just talking to them a little bit. And many of you know that if you're sick and I come and visit you, that a lot of times I read something from the scriptures before we pray together. And often I turn to the Psalms for a word to speak into our lives. And I had a psalm in mind, and I had Psalm 121 in mind, and I had picked it ahead of time in my great wisdom. And Psalm 121 is this amazing psalm that speaks about God's power and speaks about God's protection. And there we are sitting with this man with his leg up in a cast because he had slipped and fell off of a ladder. And I start reading from Psalm 21. I say, I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. So far, so good. I continue reading on through verse 3. It says, He will not let your foot slip. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. And then I stop reading, and we kind of just all sit there real quiet like, I mean, what do you say, right, at that point? The guy fell off a ladder. The Bible says God won't let his foot slip. And he looks over at me and he says, well, would have been good if you would have done that earlier. We were learning. You know, I bet some of you have been at a place like that, or you know how our friend felt. Would have been good if you would have done that earlier, God. Where were you at? I think a lot of us have had that sort of experience, that disappointment. And you know, even though I think it's hard to admit, I think sometimes we are disappointed with God. I mean, Philip Yancey, great spiritual writer, he wrote a whole book called Disappointment with God. He said that Christians often wonder if God is unfair or God is silent, if God's hidden, but they're afraid to voice those questions out loud. And I don't know for sure, but I kind of wonder if maybe that's where Martha was at, right? Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. Maybe she was a little disappointed. And watch Jesus' response. You know, Jesus doesn't get down on her. He doesn't say, how dare you doubt God? I mean, he doesn't say anything like that. He doesn't say, don't say such a thing. Jesus never says anything like that. He doesn't tell her that she lacks faith, that she's got to get over herself. When she says, if you would have been here, maybe my brother would still be alive, Jesus responds to her with a statement of fact, and he says, Martha, your brother will rise again. And he says, Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. And then Jesus asks a question, and he says to Martha, do you believe this? And I love that part of the response that Jesus gives. I love that last part. Do you believe this? That question. Because I think what he's doing is moving Martha's understanding along to a different point. You see, this right here is really the life-changing magic of disappointment. Because what disappointment can do in our lives is allow us to realign our hopes in God. And I think sometimes we're disappointed with God because we've got these false images of God. Or we've got these false images of ourselves. And we think that God's goal is to make us comfortable when in actuality God desires more than anything else to make us Christ-like. And so we get disappointed. And what Jesus does in this situation is steer Mary back to this authentic and true image of who he is and what he is doing. Jesus wants Martha to learn that he is trustworthy and true regardless of how things turn out. Jesus wants Martha to realign her hopes in God and to come to this more authentic faith. So we ask a question. But you know, it's not just disappointment with God that can trip us up when we sometimes need to realign our faith. I mean, there are so many ways to be disappointed by life. I mean, it is that moment when we feel a door close in life and we stand there wondering, what's next? Right? The door just slams in our face and we're like, now what? And that can be a very hard and painful moment. And I'm not talking about when that door slams in your face. I'm not talking about when somebody steals the good parking spot. I'm talking about how it feels when something big goes wrong. When there is something that we've been staking our lives and careers and our hopes and our reputations on, and suddenly it doesn't pan out. It's just gone. That's hard. Have you ever experienced that? I've been there. I mean, what's so hard is that you invest your hopes in a particular outcome, and then when that doesn't happen, you feel lost and downtrodden and disappointed. Now what? I mean, you ever had the door slam in your face? It's not a good feeling. We knew this young couple, and the man in this young couple had been nurturing a dream since he was a kid of being a police officer. That was his dream. He wanted to be a police officer. And he'd been preparing himself in body and mind. He was getting ready and working out, and he was going to go and take the test at the police academy. And this young man who so dearly wanted to be a police officer goes to take the test, and the results come back in, and he opens them up, and he failed the test. He didn't get in. He wanted to be a police officer, but he didn't get into the police academy. And this was this moment of deep disappointment for him, because that was what he had been planning. I mean, his whole life was aimed at becoming a police officer, and he did not get in. That was his identity. Now what? There he is standing with that rejection letter in hand. And it turned out that God was not through with him. God is never through with us in those places of disappointment. Not getting into the police academy became this opportunity for him to really look at his life and to ask some questions that he had not been willing to ask earlier, because he had been so confident about who he was going to be. And he ended up preparing with his wife to become missionaries. And they went off to the island of Papua New Guinea, and they're still there. We've been following their story. And that wasn't the beautiful ride off into the sunset. Being in Papua New Guinea has brought with it a whole other basket of disappointments and challenges. Being a missionary was not always what they imagined. But that original disappointment of not getting into the police academy led him to do some soul searching, and it was a chance for him and his wife to realign their hopes in God. This is the life-changing magic of disappointment. It makes us question what we've taken for granted. It makes us dig into our beliefs. Disappointment pops our false images of ourselves and our false images of God and our false images of life. Disappointment leads us to take God seriously as God, the one who doesn't always do what we want him to do. And we see this in Jesus' own life. That was why he showed up when he did at Lazarus' grave. I mean, he loved Lazarus and Mary and Martha. He cared for them. He comes there and he finds Lazarus dead and he weeps. Those are authentic tears. But Jesus had something bigger in mind than just healing Lazarus. He wanted to establish the power of God and show everyone that God is a God who resurrects, the God of life, that Jesus holds the power of life and death in his hands. That's why Jesus says to the disciples while they're preparing to set out, he says, look, this sickness does not lead to death, but rather it is for God's glory, that the Son may be glorified in it. Jesus had his own ends in mind. It was something bigger than just healing Lazarus. Jesus sought God's glory, and he desired to point people to God's glory. But Jesus' disciples didn't understand that. And I think at first, neither did Martha. You know, a lot of times when we face disappointment, what we have to do is confront it. Because I think when we're disappointed, especially when we're disappointed with God, we've got to ask ourselves, you know, what's really going on in my heart that leads me to feel disappointed? Is it some refusal? What's going on in here? Is it some refusal to really follow God wherever God leads? Is it some pride? Is it something that has made me feel indignant with God, indignant with life, rather than recognizing that life is a gift? And especially, I think, when we feel disappointment leading us away, because disappointment can do this. When we feel disappointment leading us away from prayer and away from our deepest identity in God, we have to not give up the struggle to return to God in humility and trust and perseverance. You know, when I look at the Bible, one story that I really love is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the book of Daniel. Do you remember that story, maybe back from your Sunday school days? It's kind of one of the Sunday school favorites. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the book of Daniel. And you remember this, the king of Babylon makes this huge statue of gold, and everyone in the kingdom must bow down and worship and venerate that statue to show their honor for the emperor, the king of Babylon. And here come Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these three Israelite young men who have been trained for service in the court of the Babylonians, and they say, no. They refuse. And the king says anyone who doesn't worship will be thrown into the fiery furnace, and these three young men, they refuse to do it, and they're thrown into the fiery furnace, right? Remember that story? And there's actually then four, the three are thrown in, and they see four, and one has the face of the Son of God. Love that line. But when the king hauls them before him, and he asks them about their choice, right? Don't you know you're going to be thrown into this fiery furnace? They say this, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They say, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. Sounds pretty faithful. And he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. So they've got this confidence. They're not afraid of the king or his fiery furnace. Our God can save us. It's the next verse where things get interesting because they go on to say, but even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. And I think that's the kind of faith that knows how to work through disappointment. This faith that says, our God is able to save us. But even if he does not, we're still going to follow him and still follow this path. But even if he does not. I think here is where we find one of the hardest gifts of all. I think this is the hardest gift of all, and it's this. Learning to love God as God. We let God be God. And that's hard to do because most of the time I think we really want God to be a reflection of our desires, to do what we want. We want God to meet our expectations, but sometimes God doesn't. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they come to the table and they say, we're going to do the right thing. God can save us. But even if he does not, we still continue. God's ways are not our ways. God's doing more than we realize in the world. God is up to more than we know. We've got to have that kind of faith that allows us to say, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that even if God doesn't do what we want, we'll still serve him. We won't be disappointed. I think that is one of the hardest gifts of all, just letting God be God, loving God as God. There was a pastor in a community nearby in the place we used to live, and I didn't know him personally, but his story started to get circulated because this pastor who served kind of a charismatic church, he came down with cancer. And this pastor, he was nearby where we lived, and he said very publicly, I'm placing my life in God's hands. I'm deciding not to do any treatment for my cancer. It's a pretty risky move. He said, I want God just to do whatever God's going to do with me, and I want God to heal me, of course, but I'm just going to go wherever God leads. And the newspaper was kind of following his story. This pastor who had said publicly that he's placing his life in God's hands. And he died. He did not experience healing, or at least not in this life. The cancer took his life. And I remember reading about him and being very impressed by his willingness to, and I'm not saying it's a good thing to not do cancer treatment. This was his path, but his willingness to just go wherever he felt God was leading him. I honestly don't know what his impact was for the kingdom. I remember him, and that's been many years ago, so he's impacted me. Sometimes God won't do what we desire. And I'm not saying, don't do cancer treatment, but just this was his choice. For me, that's one of the hardest gifts, loving God as God, letting him be God. And that's the kind of love that I think we see in Psalm 63, which is one of my favorites. Psalm 63 says, O God, you are my God. I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. It goes on. Because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. So I will bless you as long as I live. I will lift up my hands and call on your name. My soul is satisfied as with a rich feast. Your steadfast love is better than life. That's what the psalmist says. Your steadfast love is better than life, so therefore I will seek you and praise you. It's a love that desires God even more than it desires life itself. Wow. That's the life-changing magic of disappointment. We get down to brass tacks in disappointment, to that deepest part of ourselves, or at least we can. And we begin to love God more than our circumstance, more than everything that's not going our way, more than comfort, more than health, more than wealth. We come to love God even more than life itself. And in that love, we will never be disappointed. Amen.